Welcome back. In this video, I want to cover something called null. Sometimes when you're creating a variable, you'll define a variable that doesn't have a value at all. So for example, I'll add a class variable here in playstate. I'll call this var thing, and I will give it a type of HaxeFlixel. I haven't used any sort of constructor. I haven't put new HaxeFlixel here. Variables that are created without a value are called uninitialized variables. And what they contain, it depends on the type. But in the case of a class, the value here is called null. Null is basically a value that represents nothing. And you can give this value to any variable. If you have a variable of a certain type, but it actually has a value of null, and you try to get a variable or call a function from it, it will compile correctly, but you'll get an error at runtime because there is nothing there. So for example, I'm just going to type in trace thing. So I'm taking this uninitialized variable with null in it, and I'm going to type dot, and you can see all the methods are all here. All the methods and variables are all here. If I try to trace the BG color and run the game, we get an error. It says uncalled exception, invalid field access, get BG color. This is just getting the BG color from this thing, which is supposed to be an HaxeFlixel state, but it has nothing in it. So there's no BG color to get. Null is useful when you can't give a variable a value immediately. For example, if you want to create a variable later in the game, maybe a few levels down the line you want to create this variable, but you don't want to create it immediately, you can set that variable to null and then give as a value later when you actually need it. But if you use null, you have to make sure that you give that variable a value, a real value that isn't null, before you use that variable, because otherwise we'll see an error, as we just saw. The act of handling null properly is called Null Safety. And I'll cover it briefly in this video, but the Haxe manual goes over it in a lot more detail. And generally speaking, you should avoid using null if you can help it, but sometimes it's just unavoidable. So knowing how to do basic null safety is useful to know. Now I'm going to get rid of the HaxeFlixel state, but instead I'm going to use a new variable that represents the enemy. By the way, I have this enemy class from a previous bonus video that I made. If you want to copy that down, I'll let you pause and do that. But I'm going to be creating a variable of type enemy, and it will be uninitialized. So right now it has null in it. Oh, actually, yeah, hold on. I want to give this enemy a variable. It's going to be a public variable called health. And it's got a value of 10. And I'm going to trace enemy health. Now, if I compile this, it's going to give me an error because there is no enemy here yet. It's null. So to properly handle that, you can use an if statement. You just check to see if enemy is not equal to null. And I'll give it an else statement as well. If I do that and run the game, it prints out null because enemy is currently null. This is some really basic null safety. And all this really does is just check to see if the enemy is null with an if statement, and that's really it. Null safety isn't anything fancy, it's just making sure that a variable isn't null before you use it. And this is a valid way of doing so. Of course, if you actually want to add a value, you just construct enemy, enemy now has a value, and then you can trace it. It'll print out 10. There will be no errors. It seems pretty obvious, but if you are making uninitialized variables, you just need to be careful about where you're actually giving the variable some values. If you're not sure about whether or not a variable is going to be null, you probably should be using null safety with an if statement. But that's about it. I think that any HaxeFlixel programmer is going to run into null at some point, so while I don't think this is a necessary topic to know, I think it's very useful if you are using HaxeFlixel. Anyway, that's it.